But the week following that, which is March 15th, they will be taught by Megan Hollycross from Smithsonian, and then she will be talking about probing the Earth's deep oxygen cycle with vanadium. Okay, so if you're interested in this, please don't forget 2 weeks from today. Okay, now so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Linda Gunderson. So Linda is currently a scientist emeritus at USGS. So she got her PhD at University of Colorado Boulder. It was about structural geology and geochemistry. So soon after that, she just told me that in 1 year, she got her PhD.
My advisor retired and I did not finish my PhD.
That's that. So
I had a baby and I got a job offer.
You got a job offer. It's all happening in 1 year. So she moved to USGS, and sorry, I need to read that. She has so much information here. Right. So she became a research scientist and a program manager, and then she was mostly working on geochemistry. And I think one of a big part of her work in that career was about investigating the radon in the United States. So that was a really big impact. I think some of you may all know about that. So in 2001, she was appointed the chief scientist at USGS. So she was overseeing the research programs including earthquakes, volcanoes, landslides, coastal and marine geology, natural geologic mapping, energy and mineral resources, and global climate change programs. And then she decided to retire in the year 2010. And then after that, she has been the director of the Office of Science, Quality, and Integrity, which is pretty much what she's going to talk about today. So since then, she has been very active and interested in working with scientists in different agencies and compose policies about scientific integrity. So the very last thing before we allow her to talk is her husband, Joe Schmutz, is also with her today and with us today. Something special about Joe is he is our department's distinguished alumni. So welcome back, Joe. All right. So I guess without further ado, let's welcome Linda.
Yeah. Oh, thanks for having me here. I'm going to talk to you today about scientific integrity, ethics, diversity, sexual harassment. But part of the focus is going to be the scientific reasons why you should care about those things. So we'll do some introduction to terms. We'll talk about recent trends in integrity and professional ethics. And then we'll also look at diversity, inclusion, bias, discrimination, in the science, with a little bit of an emphasis on laboratory and field environments. But I want to warn you that I like to have an interactive talk. And so I'm going to be presenting some challenges to you to work on with the people near you. And we're also going to be examining things as a group. And so here's our first little group thing. You've got this cartoon here. You better show great results if you want to stay funded. And the scientist says, well, what do you know? I got great results right here. So anyone see anything ethically going on here? A science integrity issue here? Yes. So what?
Either making up the results or, maybe a few of them to make them look better, just so we can keep this one.
Yeah. And what's going on with this person here? What is this person doing by saying this? There's a little intimidation about the expectation on those results. And what are great results anyway? Right? So this is a problem we see often as people get pressured into doing things with their results that they don't really want to do. It's not an uncommon thing. This is a quote from one of my favorite little books. It comes from the National Academy of Sciences. It's called On Being a Scientist. And it's really great in terms of sharing with other people and creating dialogues. It has lots of scenarios in it, like some of the scenarios that we're going to talk about today. But they come out with, I think, the fundamental principle that the scientific enterprise is built on a foundation of trust. Society trusts us. They give us a ton of money. They trust us to do the right thing. And we trust each other as researchers to be accurate, honest, to follow scientific principles, and to accurately represent our results in our publications. And without that trust, the whole foundation of science can come down. And that trust can be undermined because science relies on the human dimension. It relies on who we are, our experiences, what interests us, how we behave by ourselves and with others, and what we think the goal of our science is. That's our values. And values are really critical in ethics. By understanding our values and our biases, and by working as a community in the sciences to foster an ethical culture of diversity, inclusion, and scientific integrity, we can greatly enhance our science. We can change the excellence of our science. So let's start with what ethics is. Well, it's a fairly complex philosophical science, but it's also the moral principles and behavioral codes that govern a person or a group's behavior. And that's what I'm going to be focusing on a lot today. Aristotle, with virtue ethics, really created the foundation for almost all ethics, and particularly scientific integrity. He extolled virtue, truth, reason, honor, goodness, and justice. And his definition of ethos, which in Greek is custom or habit, was practicing conscious choice with a moral purpose. Hippocrates was the first to write a professional applied ethics code. And he taught in medicine that respect for teachers and students and patients, that a reverence for life, that confidentiality and confidence were very important, and that you avoided harm, injustice, corruption, and sexual harassment. So, two more concepts that I want to teach you here are microethics and macroethics. Microethics has to do with you. It's your individual behavior as a scientist and your interactions within the profession. Macroethics is your responsibility to society, including the impact of your work. And it includes concepts like justice and respect for life and goodness or beneficence. So for example, a really good microethics demonstration of a scientist is they publish a scientifically sound paper in a peer-reviewed journal on the probability of a landslide in a residential area. Good work. But if you wanted to go macro, then maybe you'd provide some objective recommendations for mitigation. You might talk about uncertainty and alternatives and probabilities. You might work with engineers. You might work with the community. You might give a town talk. And that brings us to geoethics. So geoethics includes the ethical and the social and the economic and cultural implications of how you use your geosciences for societal benefits and what the societal role and responsibility of you as a geoscientist is. There's a great website by the International Association for Promoting Geoethics, lots of free references and resources on that. And there's many fields that are related to the work we do in the geosciences, including environmental ethics, nanoethics, climate ethics, etc. So what are some geoethical issues? So I'm going to give you some examples of some negative ones. So take climate change, for example. When government, industry, the media, or other interests interfere with the clear and objective representation of a geohazard risk like climate change to avoid community panic, decrease in real estate values, expensive mitigation, etc. Or when a geotechnical report misrepresents the actual data in an environment that's vulnerable in order to allow a dangerous but profitable activity. Or, for instance, when an extraction company wants to mine a resource and distorts the profit and its impact on a community and its health and its culture and its welfare. So these things happen all the time, and there's a whole field of that. I don't have time to talk about that, but I just wanted to give you a little taste of it. I want to plunge into scientific integrity because at our root, that's the basic thing that runs us as scientists. Scientific integrity is one of the most important things, and it is the thing that upholds that foundation of trust. So what's science integrity? It's adherence to those ethical principles that apply to the scientific process. Things like honesty and objectivity, fairness, openness, accountability, and stewardship. And those ones in orange are the ones as defined as core values by the National Academy of Sciences in 2017 as a requirement for good science. And then the others, clarity, reproducibility, and utility, these are things that have really come up as we've been looking at those three issues related to the scientific record. And that's the clarity, reproducibility, and utility of your scientific research publications and your communications. So, another cartoon. The antonym of scientific integrity is research misconduct, and we have a federal definition for it. It's pretty narrow: fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, but not honest mistake. However, there are institutions across the world who recognize, including University of Maryland, a whole host of detrimental behaviors, all listed there, that impact directly scientific integrity. Things from censorship to conflict of interest to discrimination, harassment, and bullying, unprofessional behavior, inadequate safety, etc. So let's take a look at this. Not the laser pointer. Let's take a look at this cartoon. So we have a character here inside their head saying, "Don't look at the axis." But speaking, as we can see in this chart, and someone in the audience saying, "What's up with the axis?" So what's going on here? Anybody? What do you think's going on? Yes?
So I can see that the person's trying to sell something, but do you actually call it misconduct based on the definition that you provided up there?
It could be. Depends on the intent. What if this is a young, early career scientist who really doesn't understand that maybe this should have been plotted log, or maybe there are no log relationships in these particular parameters? And this person right here could go up to them after the talk and say, "Let me talk to you about your chart a little bit and how you could do better." Maybe it's an honest mistake. Or maybe they're purposely trying to obscure and they're committing research misconduct.
So what if it's in between the black and the white?
So
for example, I'm just thinking of an example that I try to talk about with my students a lot. The simplest being using median, mean, or mode or something. Mm-hmm. So you could defend any one of those, but it might not be a universally accepted choice.
yeah, and so then you have to look at the practice within the discipline. And so often in different disciplines, they won't use average, or they always use median. And so it depends on that accepted practice. If there is none, then you can always advise, my understanding of the parameters in the science is this is the best representation of your data. This is the most important. This is going to get you the information others need to understand what your data means.
Yeah, so as long as there's transparency,
Yes.
I think that's what's fair, right? Because another one that comes to mind is the 2 sigma uncertainties versus 2 sigma means. And certainly 2 sigma means looks nicer. But whether or not, I don't know, I guess I see a lot of gray in some of these cases.
Yeah.
That you can make, by the definition of those terms, you could justify why you would use them, but I just wonder if based on this example, if some people consider that misrepresentation.
Yeah, And it is a gray area. That's part of one of the things that I'd like you to get from this particular cartoon, is that this person may or may not be doing research misconduct, and it takes a conversation with them, and it takes understanding what they're trying to do. And so understanding intent is really important.
Well, I think that person has like a mental mark saying, don't look at the nexus. I think it's purposely. Otherwise, there shouldn't have been that sign there. Right? If you have three like mental comments saying, don't look at the nexus.
Well, I know there's something wrong with it. There's a lot of people who got into radionuclides early and didn't think about log relationships of decaying radionuclides and plotted on straight up XY axes and made this kind of a mistake and just didn't know until a health physicist went up and whacked him on the side of the head. So it's one of these things where things can be gray and you really need to think about it. University of Maryland has a research misconduct policy. It's right up on the president's page. It's much more extensive than what I have here, but it includes fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, but it also includes serious deviations from practices commonly accepted in the discipline, like what we just talked about. And it also covers the creative arts. So it covers not only academic disciplines such as that have research components, but disciplines that have creative activities in them. It talks about some of these detrimental behaviors like improprieties of authorship, and it also talks about it doesn't include honest error, and that it does not include appropriate practices in the creative arts insofar as they're accepted standards. So it really does have to do with context and intent. So what are some of the common misbehaviors that we see in science? Well, fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism for sure. This is a study that looked at, in 2005, it's one of the biggest meta-studies around, of over 3,000 NIH-funded scientists. And this column here talked about ignoring experimental requirements, inappropriate research designs, conflict of interest. These scientists all said they had engaged, a third of them said they had engaged in at least one of these behaviors in the last 3 years. Inappropriate relationships with students or clients, inappropriate authorship, and then a host of things about data and information. Confidential information, contradictory data, overlooking flawed data, dropping observations based on feelings, withholding details of methodology or results, and inadequate record keeping. So these things do happen. And why do they happen? Well, the number one reason is lack of attention. We get overextended, we get distracted, we're not detail-oriented when it comes to compliance with rules and policy. Where we might be unsure of the rules. We didn't prioritize it as important. There were relationship problems. Staff lacked adequate training or integrity, poor communication and ambition. And this is from research that Dubois et al. Did at Researcher Rehab. So if you engage in research misconduct and you're caught, and it's not criminal, you can go to Researcher Rehab. Where they teach you how to not do that sort of thing. But I think it's amazing the research they were able to get out of it about why people do these things. And it's because people place values on things other than scientific integrity. So we attach values to everything. When we choose a project, a collaborator, collect a sample, we make decisions based upon the values that we have. And they can be scientific integrity values like honesty or ethical values like I want this to be beneficial to humanity, or they could be personal values like I want to beat the competition, I want to please my boss, I want to date that person, I want to prove my point, I want to make myself look good. And that kind of valuation changes the way we do our science. Dr. Nancy Tuana runs the Rock Ethics Institute down at Penn State. And she has this wonderful research that she's doing. And she talks about how scientists, how we're dealing today with coupled ethical epistemic issues, which require both ethics and knowledge. So take climate change. The question is not simply, how is climate changing? The question could be, what are sustainable, scientifically sound, technologically feasible, economically efficient, and ethically defensible climate risk management strategies? And that's one of the things that SCRIM at Penn State is working on. But that question is not easy to tackle. It requires rigorous, innovative work, a diversity of people and ideas across many fields, as well as conscious ethical decision-making, that's how you're going to approach it. So, pop quiz. We're going to do a pop quiz on ethical thinking. You're going to get together with the people closest to you, groups of 3, 4, 5, whatever you got. I'm going to read your challenge. I want you to think about it and then answer the questions at the end. So, this is a really great abstract challenge. A plane crashes on an island. 24 people survive. Few of them have wilderness experience. In a few days, they're starving. One person studies the fish and figures out how to catch them. The person brings the catch back to cook, and the others ask, how'd you do that? The person refuses to share the knowledge, but proposes to share the fish as long as the others do all the other work, such as getting water, gathering wood, building shelter, and cooking. So is the fish catcher ethically doing the right or wrong thing? What are the consequences if the proposal is accepted? What ethical or integrity and diversity principles can we apply to this? And how should this group survive? All right. Anyone want to share what their group came up with? Yes?
This is just small scale capitalism.
Yes, it's a form of that. Yes.
We were thinking that it wasn't ethical for the fish catcher to not share their knowledge because they're holding on to the power of the fish.
The power of the fish. They're holding on to life and death. Yeah. Yes?
So we were really concerned that if this fish person walks off a cliff or something, then everybody is screwed.
Yep.
So you need some redundancy.
That's right. Anything else? Yes?
Just to play devil's advocate here, we said perhaps the intentions of the fish catcher are not to hoard power, or maybe it's really dangerous to go get that fish, and they don't want people to go try because they're untrained, and then they would hurt them.
Perhaps. How would we know, though?
Well, it doesn't ask about communication.
Yes.
Well, we were discussing that too, how it might be dangerous to get the fish, but even if that's the case, if the others have at least some knowledge of how to get it, then if something happens to the person who gets the fish, they have at least some chance of survival, even if that person remains the person who usually gets the fish.
And a buddy system maybe where you have 2 people go instead of just one person.
Anyone else?
I also like the devil's advocate perspective. This person's saving everyone's life at the same time, right?
Possibly.
So we're all focusing on...
And if they run out of fish, they might eat them.
Yes.
Yeah, we had a similar point. While we agreed that overall it was probably not ethical for this person to hold on to that knowledge, but there might be. I mean, you could justify it by saying that we don't, if they don't know each other, right, and if there is a lot of competition down the line, this person maybe wants to. It depends on the group. If the group is friendly and everything, then maybe being more magnanimous is the way to go. But if you're not sure about the group, then holding on to your knowledge gives you that edge.
Which maybe that's a good thing amongst a large group of starving people.
it's a deserted island.
This one's, every time I do this, people's responses are different. One of my favorite responses was that this guy will finally get everyone motivated enough to do something about their situation. So I won't always give you answers, and these answers are from an ethical perspective, not mine, but they are from various philosophies in ethics. This isn't ethical at all. It doesn't consider the greater good. It's not fair, reasonable, honorable, just. It's not inclusive. It's not collaborative. It doesn't solve the most fundamental problem, which is everybody's starving and people are going to die. Consequences which you guys got were food source, dependence on a single source, tyrannical rule, fear-based society. It doesn't use the scientific method at all.
Got a question up there.
Yeah.
How does it not solve the problem if everybody is now eating and no longer starving?
Well, I don't know if he can catch 24 fish.
He said he'd share the fish. But with the assumption that...
Yeah, he gets to decide how much water you have to drink to fish.
But that's not the thing. It said it didn't solve the
Worst case scenario.
You know, the good thing about ethics is it is about dialogue, and you can perfectly challenge things. That's what this exercise is about, is challenging each other's ideas about what's ethical. From a perspective of certain ethical philosophies, there's a greater good philosophy that could look at this both ways. But it doesn't use a scientific method, and it doesn't consider diversity of thought on the problem, like maybe someone else could figure out a safer way to fish or get more fish at a time. There's no honesty, open access, or peer review. But if these folks collaborated, maybe there would be a diversity of ideas that could solve the problem a little better for the greater good than the one solution. Maybe. But this was really, really good. And that's what you need to do, is you need to think about these problems because you're going to be faced with them. And so ways to solve this problem is you look at what's wrong, you check the facts, you identify relevant factors like laws and codes and rules, you develop lists of options. How will you or your group act? And then you test the options. Who's it going to harm? Who's it going to benefit? Would you like to see it on the front page of the Washington Post? What would your advisor think? What would your colleague think? And you make a choice collaboratively if you can. And then you decide what can you and others do to prevent future situations like that. So right now, a lot of professional societies are rethinking their ethics policies. And a lot of this has come about because of Me Too, because of situations that have just started coming up, because of a little more transparency and publication and peer review, people studying reproducibility. Lots of factors have gone into this. But AGU, GSA, ESA, AAAS, all of these folks are looking at their policies. And in particular, they're taking action against harassment and discrimination. We have some world standards on research integrity. The Singapore Statement that came out in 2010 is an internationally accepted standard. I work with the American Geophysical Union to augment this in 2017, and I'm going to show you a little bit of that. And one thing I really want to show you is this Young Scientist Code of Ethics, which was put together last year. 40 scientists from all around the world talked about what they value the most ethically. So the Singapore Statement and the American, yes?
Will you talk about enforcement at all? Because I think changing the wording of an ethics policy is great, but if somebody's walking that ethical line and the people in charge don't actually enforce the policies that they're supposed to, does changing the principles
Yeah.
or the core values of that statement really even matter?
Yeah, and that's a great point. So I can tell you the American Geophysical Union put together an extensive policy on how they would respond to violations of their code, and they enforce it. And so people are escorted from meetings. They have, and it's been tough for them. It's been tough the last couple of years enforcing that. And I worked on the code for the U.S. Geological Survey, Department of Interior, AGI, which is inspirational, so it doesn't have enforcement, AGU, which is enforced, DOIs and USGSs are enforced, and I actually did sat judgment on those and implemented their allegation processes. And if people even perceive that there'll be no follow-up, a policy is worth zero. And so you have to have people know and understand that it's going to be enforced. And you have to have people buy into it. So the main principles of the Singapore Statement and the American Geophysical Union are a lot of things that I think you're familiar with, like excellence, integrity, accountability. But we've really tried to make an emphasis on courtesy, equity, and fairness. We try to emphasize that scientists should have the ability to responsibly pursue science without interference or coercion. And this is really big internationally. Unselfish cooperation, we're talking about open science and transparency, good stewardship of research and data on behalf of others. This is like huge in science right now. Legal compliance and a humane approach. And I'm not going to go through all of these things. What I want to do is just emphasize again, these are responsibilities in both of those policies, this idea of equity and fairness, the importance of research records and research findings, the replication, respecting intellectual property, data management and preservation, and finally peer review. Peer review is just huge, and since a number of studies have come out looking at biases in peer review, a lot of journals, scientific journals, AGU included, are really looking at their peer review processes. The reporting of irresponsible research practices is really big. The thing is, people just don't report. They just don't. But if you can create an environment that upholds a safe, open, and professional environment where people feel safe and they feel like they can respond, then you will get that reporting and you will create a positive environment. Also, American Geophysical Union, for instance, added societal considerations about starting to think geoethically about our science and starting to think about stewardship of the earth. And these are pretty new elements in scientific integrity codes. So we're going to do another challenge. This is a purely scientific integrity one. You help a colleague with research similar to yours. You provide some leads and some references. You even let them look at a draft of your paper and press that you think will be helpful. Your colleague is struggling. They do not have much data and are short on time, and GSA is just a month away. A month passes, you visit your colleague's poster, and you recognize passages from your own paper and from the references that you gave to them. The passages are nearly verbatim. There's no citations. The data graphs look perfect. Your colleague is the lone author. And now here they are strolling up to you smiling. So, what are the issues? Who's affected? What are your options to resolve it? What would you do if you were a colleague or an advisor? Go. All right, anyone want to volunteer what they think's going on here and answer that first question? Let's. What are the scientific integrity and ethical issues here? I think it's kind of a long list. Anyone?
I think we thought that both the person who plagiarized and GSA is already involved. So the question is, should the person affected escalate this and involve GSA, or just let it be an interpersonal kind of conversation or an email exchange? Has it reached a stage where GSA needs to be involved, or do you not escalate it to that point?
That's a good question. And I'm going to answer in a second. I want to hear some more from people. What do you think? What are some of the scientific integrity issues?
It's definitely plagiarism.
Plagiarism. Yeah.
Yeah, and it could be worse. The
Yeah.
data, we're like, what data were in this paper or this poster?
Yeah.
So it could be either plagiarism of data,
Yep.
or manufacturing of data. They're
Yep.
totally
Some intellectual property
Yep.
issues.
The problem
Nope.
with this scenario, though, is who is the enforcer. So once it gets to a publication stage, I think it's a pretty clear cut. You know, you tell if somebody's plagiarized your stuff, you tell the editor or whoever. But at a meeting, if it's a poster, even a talk, I'm not sure who you go to. Who would enforce it? GSA doesn't have the resources to send somebody off to try to assess whether or not there's plagiarism going on. That's something that occurs at the publication stage.
It's not crystal clear to me that the person who stole the data was also thinking about these things deeply, right? And just by sending the results, you're sort of making a marking, and I don't think it's like very straightforward.
Good. So this is when you have what we call a courageous conversation. You're the colleague, you work with this person, you go up to them, you ask them to walk them through the poster, and you ask, why didn't you cite any of the papers? Look, some of this stuff is verbatim. You know, we don't do that. We try and avoid plagiarism. You try and give them enough of the benefit of the doubt, but also point out issues and hear what and why and how they did this, so that you can understand what's going on. And if the person did do all the ethical things that it sort of looks like they did, then you might tell them, you got to take this down. You really can't show this. You could get in trouble. And you need to learn some of the things to do. This could be an early career scientist. This could be someone who didn't value compliance. This could be someone who was never taught good scientific process, or it could be someone who's deliberately trying to make themselves look good because they got someone coming to see them as a prospect for graduate school. Yes?
There's actually a way you could turn this into something positive.
Yes.
So the person's coming up to them smiling. They're like, sounds like totally ignorant of all these things that they just did. Let's assume maybe that's the case. There's all the issues with blatant plagiarism, like be the brave scientist, go in and say, look, you forgot to cite both me and these other people. That would have been easy to do. And look, here's your data, there's my data, they merge into one plot. This is fantastic. If you broke out your data and my data in different colors, that would say not only did you find something that has these great relationships, but it validates something I already found, which makes your data even more important, and both of our data even more important. Great opportunity here.
It's a fantastic
teaching.
teaching
The data
moment.
out and making it clear what's yours actually makes the whole paper stronger, not weaker, and that's almost always the case.
Yes. And that's what we're after, is having that courageous conversation with people first. Not always assuming the worst. But when it does turn out to be, if it does turn out to be the worst, you as the colleague or as a bystander can coach them to do the right thing. And in this case, it's to take the poster down. Because there's issues. Now, if it's just a matter of a lack of citation, you can help them get the citations up there. Write them on the bottom. But if it comes down to fabrication of data, the poster's got to come down. And if this were happening at a, let's say, a research meeting hosted by the National Science Foundation, you would certainly make sure that it came down. Because lots of things would happen as a consequence of that. You have a question?
It was kind of interesting. I mean, like, one thing that was brought up was because of the power differential that could happen if it was a student versus someone like their advisor. It was brought up about, that they would talk to somebody of parallel power to talk to them. And, I mean, as Rich said, once it's published, that's hard to, you can't do anything about
That's
that.
right.
But the thing that's really that really hit hard when you were talking about that was, I think, the student advisor or postdoc mentee relationship, where people don't feel comfortable talking to their advisor about that, because their whole career might, depend on them. And so, that's it's one of those things where I think it's really it's even more harder to address. Would you tell your advisor, hey, take down that poster, or like, hey, why didn't you include me? People might not, I don't know, it's just, I'm not saying to.
No, it's very hard. It's very hard to have that courageous conversation. And so something, if you guys want to play with more of these scenarios, AGU has made free this big appendix of scenarios that I've put together in a book that I published on scientific integrity and ethics in the geosciences. And you can download it for free, and they're really great to take a look at and dialogue about. In the case of an advisor here, what you want to hope is that the advisor is going to take a mentoring stance and have the courageous conversation with the person and try and see what kind of intent there is there and correct and use it as a teaching moment, as Karen talked about. So it's just really important because you don't want to lose this scientist necessarily unless they're, unmitigatedly evil. Yes.
So I would argue if it's a really clear-cut case of plagiarism or data falsification, that it's not enough to just take a poster down, because there's an abstract that's going to leave an imprint of that work that will be potentially cited in the future.
Good.
So, so how do you take care of that without getting, going to a higher level?
So if you have the courageous conversation with this person and you see that they have the full intent to fabricate, plagiarize, to talk about this like this is the real stuff and it's not the real stuff, and they have resisted any of your recommendations, then you do have to go through authoritative processes. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So we start with, if conditions are right, we speak with the person who may be conducting the misconduct, clarify the situation, advise them in a non-threatening way, and find some options for them. And this is courageous conversation or a bystander intervention. But if it happens as part of a formal process, as Rich pointed out, a publication, a funding proposal, a professional meeting, etc., you utilize the formal processes related to that event. That's the journal, the funding agency, the professional society, or your institution. If you've tried to have that conversation and you've tried to help mitigate the situation with the person. Because you have to follow up on the scientific record. It needs to be corrected. It needs to be dealt with. That scientist needs to know that there are consequences for that kind of action. You speak with a colleague, a supervisor, an advisor, if it's safe, about the situation, when it's not necessarily part of a formal process, or you can speak with them and say, what do you think I should do, and have them help you go through the formal process. Here at University of Maryland, you have ombudsmans and you have RIOs, Research Integrity Officers. You also have ethics offices, EEOC, Office of Human Resources. If it's a really bad situation, which we're going to talk about pretty soon, you call security or 911. You can speak with the ethics person in a professional society. A lot of professional societies provide service for you to talk something out. In a worst case scenario, you report the misconduct to the Inspector General if the work is federally funded. So those are, in order of increasing urgency. But you try up front to ascertain what the intent is and what's going on. And it's hard to do it, but it's necessary to do it. And thank you for doing that. That he is not a plant. So let's talk about the Young Scientist Code of Ethics. They had all the rigorous scientific integrity kinds of things that I talked to you about, but then they also had engaging with the public, pursuing the truth, minimizing harm, engaging with decision makers, supporting diversity, and being a mentor. And it's these two that I'm going to start talking about now. Providing that environment in which the ideas of all are evaluated equally, regardless of individual characteristics and on the basis of evidence. Creating an inclusionary, positive, open environment where you make an effort to include the ideas of everyone. And being a mentor. And it doesn't matter if you're an advisor or you're an undergraduate student. Being available, guiding, trusting, and empowering less experienced researchers to help them reach their professional goals and realize their full potential. When you do that, all science advances. Creating an environment of trust and respect for all individuals. It's just so super important. And it's what I'm seeing time and time again in the generation of scientists coming up that they value. So, diversity and inclusion and its effect on science. Well, there's a ton of science that diversity directly affects scientific outcomes in society. Decades of research. That diverse groups are more innovative, more creative, and they're better at solving complex problems. They undertake way more comprehensive analyses. And there's a ton of great research on this. One of the ones that I'd like to particularly point out to you is this special issue of the Scientific American, How Diversity Empowers Science and Innovation. Great example in there about the evolution of primate research and how, as it evolved, the different groups who examined primates, the different perspectives that they brought, and how it took decades to get a whole picture of primate behavior because the researchers that came at it came from only their perspective and not multiple perspectives. So, why aren't we more diverse? Well, it's a really complex question. There's a lot of factors, and I think you know some of them: academic structure, academic pipelines, socioeconomic walls, cultural customs and values. Lots of individual decisions are made that affect why or why not we're diverse. But there are two broad issues that we have control over, and those are bias and discrimination. And those two things directly affect the excellence of our science. So, here's a test. You are on a committee to choose the next postdoc fellowship in your department. These are your candidates. They all have pretty much the same exact resumes and qualifications. Who are you going to pick? Those are your choices. Those are your choices. Who are you going to pick? All the same qualifications.
Does tattoo count as diversity?
So, you're starting to look at them and you're going, maybe your mind starts drifting to valuation of appearance. Maybe your mind starts drifting to valuing age. Maybe your mind starts drifting to who looks the most enthusiastic. So does that mean you're biased? Yes, if you're conscientiously doing it, yeah. But if you're not conscientiously doing it, it means you have implicit bias issues. And you can deal with that because you can understand them. You can get to know them. There's a great website called implicit.harvard.edu that gives you a test on your implicit biases. It takes a little time to do. I did it. and came out with a slight bias towards old people. And being an old person, that concerned me. Against. Yeah. So it was slight, but still, I was like, what's that about? So I started doing a lot of research on ageism. And it's remarkable in American society how much ageism we have, but how little it's talked about. So if you've got some time, take the test. It's really interesting. And it really will open your eyes and make you look at things differently. It certainly did that for me. So, thoughts and feelings that are implicit, if we're unaware of them, are mistaken about their nature, they're an unconscious manifestation. So this shows you how implicit bias works. You walk up to a group of people, your words, the tone of your voice, your body language, your gestures you make, how you interact with people, has and is greatly affected by your feelings, dreams, fears, experiences, prejudices, your biases, your values, your beliefs. And it shows. When they become explicit, when you're fully aware of them, then you have a full-blown bias. And bias is when you're no longer neutral. So implicit biases drive our explicit behavior. They change our perspective, and they guide our perspective and decisions. Knowing what assumptions we're making about our values, about our implicit biases, really helps us do a better job in terms of making decisions and in terms of our behavior. This is especially true if we want to improve our behavior and broaden our approach. And it's really important in science not to have implicit biases that interfere with objective science. So, like I said before, discrimination and bias are two things we can have control over. Discrimination can be a criminal activity, as can be harassment. In general, discrimination is unequal and unfair treatment. It becomes a legal issue if opportunities, education, benefits, evaluations, and employment are involved. And it includes retaliation and harassment. And the same is true with harassment, which is discrimination. And that's an intense or severe single act or multiple persistent or pervasive acts. Unwanted, unwelcome, demeaning, abusive, offensive behavior. It becomes illegal, once again, as above with discrimination, when it's a condition of an opportunity. Or when the conduct is severe enough that it creates an environment that most people will think is hostile. Sexual harassment is the sexual form of this. Unwanted and unwelcome sexual advances, requests for favors, verbal and physical harassment of a sexual nature, gender harassment, gender discrimination, and sexual coercion. And bullying is also harassment, that use of force or threat or coercion to abuse, intimidate, or aggressively dominate others. And it involves either real or perceived power imbalances. So I was on the committee that looked at sexual harassment of women in academic sciences, engineering, and medicine. We came out with our report last June, and since then both NIH and NSF have taken the recommendations and changed their sexual harassment policies. I'm going to just highlight a few of the results of that because we did a lot of meta-analysis and we did some new research. We found that sexual harassment is common in academic science, engineering, and medicine. The best available analysis to date shows that 50%, now listen, of women faculty and staff experience sexual harassment. Student surveys from universities show that between 20 to 50% of students experience sexual harassment from faculty or staff. And organizational climate is the most important factor in determining whether sexual harassment is likely to occur. Hello? So I always look up when I hear that particular ringtone because it's my daughter's. And I know my daughter's calling. So surveys show that women, minority women, and the LGBTQ community are more likely to be harassed. So some examples, a big meta-analysis, over 86,000 respondents, 55 independent probability samples report 58% of women having experienced harassing behaviors at work in academia, military, and the private sector. Minority women experience sexual harassment as a result of both gender and race discrimination and experience more harassment than white women, white men, and men of color. And a survey of 489 LGBTQ community folks found 51% had experienced or knew someone who had experienced sexual harassment. This is a groundbreaking survey that Katie Clancy did with her laboratory. They surveyed academic field experiences in archaeology and biology, in geology, and a number of other field-oriented sciences. They had 142 men respond and 516 women. And as you can see, 64%, both men and women, experienced verbal sexual harassment. 20% experienced sexual assault, including both men and women. Very few people were aware of a mechanism to report or actually reported it or were satisfied by the outcome of reporting. And we found time and again in our study that people just do not report this. Where does sexual harassment of women occur? In male-dominated institutions, or where there's male domination of leadership, where there's a strong power differential, high stress, casual drinking rules, harassment tolerated, lack of rules, lack of enforcement, perceived risk of complaining, and a belief that complaints will not be taken seriously. The negative effects are staggering, and I think you guys have read about this in the newspapers of whole universities having to deal with the effects of harassing environments. It damages professional productivity, and it directly affects scientific integrity. That's the result of the National Academy's study. And they said sexual harassment, discrimination in general, harassment in general, as well as sexual harassment, is as important as fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism on its impact on scientific integrity. It produces fear, it limits and biases the science, people lose funding and jobs. It affects not only the witnesses, but work groups. There's a loss of talent and disruption. It impacts recruitment and retention. But it's that repression of a portion of the workforce and the continued replication and continuance of those unethical, costly practices that institutions really need to pay attention to. So your very last challenge, and I only have one more slide after this, so we'll make this quick. You're on an overnight field trip with a male and female professor, 10 undergraduate and graduate students. While camping that night, you head to the bathroom. You see your female professor flirting with one of the undergraduate men, touching him on the shoulders, and notice that he backs away, looks uncomfortable. She grabs his hand and says, "Hey, you know you want it," and starts to kiss him. The student breaks it off, says he has to get some sleep, and leaves. You go to the male professor's tent and tell him, and his answer is, "Gee, some guys get all the luck. Forget about it. He can handle himself." So what should you do? Is this sexual harassment? What are the consequences? And as a bystander, what's your responsibility? Anyone want to answer that first question? What should you do? All right, we'll start with the other one. Is this sexual harassment? Yes. Yes. What should you do? Yes.
I would talk to the person who's affected. Okay, I witnessed this. This isn't okay. I think we should talk about how we're going to move on, because both people are involved.
And there might be a backstory. You never know. You never know what's going on. But
even if there's a backstory, there's a hierarchical issue here, and it's a faculty and a student, and there shouldn't be a backstory.
yeah,
It's an
exactly.
inappropriate relationship
But
just because
but
of that.
but it's important to know if there's a backstory, because if there is no backstory, like if this person hasn't engaged, then there's a whole area of protection that you want. If they have engaged and they don't want to engage anymore, there are some other things that get considered. Now, that's not something that I want, but there are things that get considered. Trying to figure out how to explain it best. But understanding what's going on, I think, is the most important thing. Understanding what the person is experiencing. You witnessed sexual harassment no matter what, even if there is a backstory. And the consequences of reporting or not reporting this are pretty big. Did anybody discuss those, the consequences of reporting? Yes?
I think like one of the consequences of not reporting is that that person can have that like inappropriate relationships with other students or other people.
Exactly.
And it just breeds an unhealthy environment in that department.
Exactly.
And the acquiescence of it, the male professor saying, oh, yeah, just blowing that off, that means there's two faculty in that department that don't think that this is an issue.
That's right.
Big problem, yeah.
So there could be an entire issue of the environment at that department. Yes.
So we were talking about if the victim doesn't want to report, but you as a bystander report to like Title IX office, does the Title IX office have the authority to actually investigate the accused?
So universities implement Title IX differently, and I don't know if does anyone know if at University of Maryland?
'Cause I don't think they do here, but I could be wrong.
So some universities have requirements. So for instance, the professor who it was reported to and who said, don't worry about it, he's got a reporting requirement.
If a student comes
That
to you
doesn't mean
and says,
anything.
I saw this, you have an obligation to
Yeah.
report. So
Well,
because
an
someone else
obligation
comes-
doesn't mean they will.
Even as a
No,
bystander?
no,
Bystander
but they
comes and
do.
tells you, you have to report?
They do have an obligation,
or
and
the
lots of
person affected.
universities have that. Not all of them do, but lots
By
of
the
them do.
bystander, though. Okay.
Who had first-hand knowledge. He observed it. It's not like something he heard.
So it doesn't need to be only the victim.
I was figuring even that nothing can happen, even if this isn't covered by whatever you have, that at least it gets those two on the radar and having been involved in something inappropriate. So that if something else comes up again, then it starts being a pattern, and which may allow something to happen, rather than, a first time type of deal.
Okay.
So
one of the things I want to tell you about the backstory issue, and I didn't want to really get into this because of time, but if there is criminality that you learn in the backstory issue, you have no choice, because otherwise you're an accomplice. Yes?
So what happens when you do report to universities? So me and 4 other girls got assaulted by a guy at our undergrad institution. He went to a different one, and now he works at NASA. So it's like, I guess, he teaches like undergrad students as well currently. So it's like, what does the university do after they leave?
So did you report?
Yeah.
Did you?
Initially, the university did nothing about it, but I said I was going to go to the cops and the media, and then they kicked him out of the undergrad institution that I
But they didn't do a Title IX.
So I just went off the radar.
Yeah, so if they don't do a Title IX investigation, which the way it's implemented unevenly may or may not follow him. And so that's one of the issues that we're having. It's one of the big issues brought up in the report, is that we need these things that go through full investigations through Title IX to follow a person rather than just moving the problem. Because moving the problem is a huge problem. It exists within universities. It exists within federal agencies. I know firsthand about moving the problem. And it doesn't do anything for anybody if you just move it. So if there was a full investigation and there was a finding, then that's really critical in these issues. And they're hard to do. They're not easy. And with Title IX being looked at again as a vehicle for whether it should cover sexual harassment and sexual harassment policy, a lot of universities' sexual harassment policies are being relooked at again to see how they can deal with that. But you guys have a sexual harassment policy that was updated in 2017. Become aware of it. It's got a process. It's got things to do. And you do have responsibilities. And so that main thing about the backstory is that criminal activity. And when you see something criminal, you have to report it. You don't have a choice, really. The faculty here, the one that was informed, he doesn't have a choice. He has to report it. As a bystander, you need to, because the staggering impact of these kinds of things can just disrupt whole things. And I don't mean, this. When I always get to this part, it's a real downer for people, but it's a reality in our community, and it's something that we have control over, that we can fight. Yes.
So one related point we discussed was how the gender roles and the expectations might dictate what you do. So here it's a female professor harassing a male student. So maybe the dismissive attitude of the other faculty member is maybe informed by that condition. And what should we do in that case to, support male students who might be, facing this kind of situation? Has there been any study looking into that? Like how do you support male students?
Yeah, so the science of male harassment is small. The studies are small. And as you saw in that field study one, that was a significant number of men who were harassed. There is much more research that is starting to go on because we're trying to look at discrimination and harassment from all perspectives. So ageism, gender, both genders, sexual orientation, any number of things. It has really been, there's a lot more research that is being started in that direction. And part of that, too, is businesses help drive some of this because it is so costly to them to have these things happen. And people like Google and Microsoft and everything else are helping to drive and fund some of this research. And at the academic level, folks like NIH and others are trying to fund more research, especially about the efficacy of policy, of practices, in stopping it. But like they said, they find one of the number one things is the environment. And we're all responsible for the environment that we're in. We can, if we work together, change the research and learning environments that we're in. And it's a long road, but it's what you can control and it's what you can do. It's tough. It's tough. Yes?
So one of the things I think is interesting here is it says bystander. And most people, the word bystander sounds so passive, like you're just sort of in the room or something. But it's really, this bystander was an observer with empirical data.
That's right.
Which as a scientist, that's a completely different thing to think of it as opposed to, I'm just a bystander, I have no obligation. No, you have empirical data, and without it, you can't change the culture.
Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions on this one? And we're just going to wrap up. Yes?
So you were saying about having to report criminal activity, and in that scenario, the woman touched him on his shoulders and grabbed his hand. And where is criminal in that?
That's when I was talking about the backstory. So
yeah.
you might go and talk.
To know that.
Yeah. So I think it got away from us. I said you especially want to have the conversation with him, and you especially, I can't remember my exact words, but it was especially in trying to understand the backstory. So let's say, for instance, the backstory is this person has sexually assaulted this other person repeatedly and coerced them, holding over their head, whatever. That's criminal. So
in that case, theoretically, if I know that, I would have already reported them.
Yeah, but you don't know from this experience. But you would know, perhaps, if you talk to them. And that's why I didn't go into the whole backstory thing, because that's a very tough conversation, and you want to have that conversation with people at the University of Maryland who deal with the criminal activity of sexual harassment, because they know the answers to some of these questions that I don't know. But these things that you might see, like this, and not a backstory that's criminal, are things that you can report, and that your faculty and advisors have requirements to report. And when you see them, you can report them. Yes?
One thing I found, this is very unique to academia, is that you can't fire a person in an academic program. So I think it's really hard to make a professor very accountable. Because the manager of a professor is a colleague. It's not like industry where manager can fire somebody. So I think that is really making difficult to make improvement.
Yes. I think one of the things that I just really want you to walk away from that particular scenario with is there are things that you can do. There are people responsible for following up with these things. And each university has a different set of rules related to sexual harassment. Read them if you haven't. It's really good to know what they are. One of the things that I hope from my talks is that people go deeper into some of the subjects that you saw today, and that you're more aware of some of the things that are out there. It's important for us to know, and it's important as contributors to a scientific community to know them. And they aren't all devastating. I hate this part of the talk because I look at everyone's face and they're like, oh, because it's a very hard subject. And we're tired and we want beer. And it's Friday. But I thank you all for staying this long. I'm leaving you with Bill Watterson's quote. And I'm just going to do the last half of it. Sooner or later, we're all asked to compromise ourselves in the things we care about, and we define ourselves by the action that we take in that situation. With each decision, we tell ourselves and the world who we are. So go make good decisions.